Welcome to The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky, a weekly podcast that breaks down politics, policy, and current affairs. I'm Becky Scherr.
And I'm Michael Brodkorb.
We are bringing you yet another bonus episode this week. Today we are going to sit down with Joe Teirab, candidate for Congress in Minnesota's 2nd District. Teirab is running for the CD2 Republican Party endorsement at the convention this upcoming weekend, April 27th. He announced Sunday night that while he is still seeking the endorsement, he plans to continue his campaign through the August primary. We will talk with Teirab about his background and why he chose to run for office. We will break down his travels throughout the district and what he's hearing on the campaign trail. And we will end by breaking down why he believes he is the best person to take on Angie Craig and how he thinks he can win in November. But first, let's set the stage on the dynamics in the 2nd Congressional District for Republicans. Michael.
I live in the 2nd Congressional District. I live in Eagan, and so I follow the race. And it seems that things kind of explode in the last week or so in MN 2. You have some working experience down in the 2nd Congressional District.
Absolutely. So back in 2018, I was a campaign manager for Jason Lewis's reelection campaign when he was seeking a second term. Unfortunately, we did not get past the finish line there. Angie Craig, that is when she was elected and has been serving ever since. It is a slightly different district. Redistricting did happen. The district has changed a little bit. And so I don't know exactly what we're looking at here, but it's an interesting base. You've got moderates. There's a lot of Dakota County in there. You've got more of the conservative far-right folks down Rice County and southern part of the district. And so it's some very interesting dynamics, some really good people. I met a lot. We had lot of really hard workers, but there's definitely some people who want to throw elbows and make things difficult throughout this process, just like there is in all of congressional districts. But second is definitely an interesting beast.
It's likely going to be the most targeted race in Minnesota. This, from a congressional district standpoint, probably the most volatile, correct?
Yeah, from in terms of, I guess, biggest potential to maybe flip one way or the other.
And so it was Lewis won it. So Lewis beat Craig, and then Craig beat Lewis, and then she's been there now since she's won 2 re-elections since she beat Jason Lewis, correct?
Correct.
And so it's a volatile district politically. And so it's going to be interesting to see how the map, it's going to be interesting to see how the candidates shape up. Here's my just general read, just my observations, and I've been pretty consistent about this. And I know people on both sides of the campaign, and I've spoken to people on both sides, but here's my general take. My general take is Taylor Rahm, who's, I think, likely going to win the endorsement on Saturday, has run a very strong battle to win the endorsement. I think Teirab, he has run I think he's done more work, I think, to present himself as a strong primary candidate, strong general election candidate. My read of it is a couple things. There's 2 candidates, obviously, seeking the endorsement this Saturday, Joe Teirab and Taylor Rahm. Rahm has run, by all accounts, a campaign that's been hyper-focused on winning the endorsement. I think they're going to be endorsed. I've been saying for quite some time, for the last month or so, maybe a little bit longer, that I thought Rahm was likely going to get the endorsement. And so the issue that develops is we have 2 different campaigns right now. We have a campaign that's been running solely focused on winning the endorsement and very limited financial resources. And then Teirab's campaign announced last week some fundraising totals that were really impressive in terms of where a candidate should be. Angie Craig is leaps and bounds in the stratosphere in terms of a well-run, financed campaign. But my concern is that we're in once again, one of these endorsement type situations where we have a candidate who has committed themselves far too much into only being able to focus on winning the endorsement and not done, I think, any type of groundwork or legwork to position themselves and springboard themselves out of the convention once they get the endorsement. And so I think Teirab is the only candidate that I think is able to run or is any type of position right now on the Republican side to be in a position to take the fight to Angie Craig. And so from a partisan perspective, just wearing that Republican hat, it seems to me that there's only one candidate that's in a position to fight.
I love to play devil's advocate when I have the opportunity. But my take of it is maybe zoomed out a little bit and is focusing on the issue we have with the endorsement process in itself, because we do tend to set ourselves up for this, right? Where you have to focus on these, in this case, 250, 300 delegates at the CD2 level, because traditionally, unfortunately, candidates who do not get the endorsement have not historically been successful on primary day. So we have this dynamic where you sink so much resources, and then you are come out, whether that's a CD convention or a state convention, come out having bled all this money, and where do you go from there? But we've talked a lot about, as much as I enjoy the endorsement process, I was BPOU chair, I was delegates for years, I've worked on campaigns. We've talked about the chess match that the endorsement battle can be. It does also hamstring you because you are forced to also have these different messaging campaigns. We talked a lot about this with Scott Jensen, that you are forced to message to the farther right, and then in the August primary moderate a little bit, and then to November. And so there's so many dynamics at play. While on one hand, enjoy the game of the endorsement process, I am a believer of the primary. I think we need to have a primary. I think it should be a June primary, but I think it should be a primary system. So I don't have an issue with a candidate going to a primary. I do think that is a good battle. Money is certainly, Angie Craig has almost $3 million in the bank. Going up against that, when you also know that the DCCC is going to come out behind her, likely some other groups, she's got friends with deep pockets. It's going to be a mountain to climb for anybody. And unfortunately, money talks, and it's going to be tough for a campaign that has, less than $100,000 in the bank. Unfortunately, that is a tough place to come out and make those inroads that you need to do to take down a candidate with millions in the pocket.
Correct. And I think we're still in that same trap. And you articulated it very well. I've supported candidates that went through the endorsement process. I've supported candidates who have been outside of the endorsement process. I'm for whatever makes, putting on that partisan hat again, I'm for whatever makes it easier for Republicans to win in this state. And I'm hard pressed to look at this process that we're looking at in the 2nd Congressional District, where we have one candidate who is, and that's Rahm, who I think is absolutely going to get endorsed this weekend, who appears to have only focused on the endorsement process and has done no outside work to raise money to put him in a position to win. And so my concern is, just from, again, wearing that partisan hat, Republicans will endorse a candidate likely in the 2nd Congressional District who has done no work, substantial work to win to put him in his campaign in a position to win. There is this misconception that with the endorsement process comes all this money, there's like this mythical or fancy, mysterious dump truck that shows up to a convention that just dumps all this cash out. It just simply doesn't happen.
Right.
And so Rahm's campaign has shown that they can't raise money right now. What the party is going to be left with, if he's endorsed on Saturday, is a candidate endorsed in likely the only competitive district that will be in Minnesota this election cycle. And that candidate is going to be without money and has messaged himself so far to the right that he's not in any position to win. And that's the other concern that I have from just an operational standpoint. And I've said this to supporters and people with Rahm's campaign. So this information they're hearing today isn't new, which is that they have not fundraised. And so they're going to leave that convention on fumes if they have any money when they leave that convention. And then from a messaging standpoint, they have no opportunity to pivot and to moderate their message. Here's why I would say that. One of the things that happened with Jensen, and we talked about Jensen in last year, and we had multiple episodes, and we hope to have him back soon to talk about what's going on in endorsement process stuff. But Jensen was the COVID candidate. He messaged on COVID. And one of the concerns that people raised about Jensen up until the endorsement process was that if he was the general election candidate or if he was endorsed, all he would talk about would be COVID. And that was a concern. And there was a hope and kind of a wish that Jensen could pivot. But a couple people had said to me prior to the endorsement, and it panned out to be true, which was that Jensen's rise to power came through that message. And so he wasn't going to be able to leave that message once he was endorsed. And the concern I have with Rahm's campaign is they have aligned themselves with Action for Liberty and a number of people that I would consider to be on the fringe of the Republican Party and that are ultra conservative to the point of, I think, being obnoxious and not holding positions where people can actually get elected. But particularly with a number of the Action for Liberty crowd, that is going to be nearly impossible for Rahm to moderate on his message. He's just simply, you cannot moderate when you've aligned yourself with some of the people that Rahm has aligned himself with. And I think it's going to be a huge both messaging problem for him in terms of who he is as a candidate. And also, I think it's going to be very difficult for him for Rahm's campaign to raise money because he has aligned himself with, I think, a crowd of folks that, and one of the other kind of messaging mistakes that I think that Rahm's campaign has made is they've taken a lot of shots at Emmer's campaign, that Congressman Emmer. They've taken shots at the entire fundraising crowd. And the point of the matter, I would say to that, is it's fun in endorsement process to claim that you're beating up on the establishment, you're beating up on the swamp. Let me say something to you. Republicans in Minnesota need money to spend and win races. And it's important that they do. And Taylor Rahm's message in the last couple weeks has, I think, really shut the door on him getting any type of significant financial help, because I think that their message has been so critical of raising any type of money, which they need. And I think that they have boxed themselves in to a position where they're going to have a very difficult time moderating themselves and winning people over, because I think their message right now is pretty hardcore. And that's where I think the mistake that's been made here. I think that the 2nd Congressional District for Republicans this cycle has really become much more extreme. The ability for someone to message and to go through the endorsement process, I think this will be a real shock to some people. The level of intensity and to see it embraced by a campaign without any concept of what it's going to take to win the general, I think is really concerning. I think it's short-sighted. And I think that Rahm is going to just have a very difficult time moving and moderating himself and winning. When you're poking people in the nose that you're going to need in the fundraising community, when you're aligning yourself with such hardcore Action for Liberty crowd, and then you want everyone to abide by this intramural contest, and your focus on that intramural contest has made you not focus on things that you actually need to win the race, it's just a recipe for disaster. And I would have expected more out of some of the people that are working on that campaign, but it hasn't turned out that way.
I think this is one of the biggest reasons why, moving to a primary and a June primary, I think is essential to the future of what Republicans, of course, we have way bigger issues than endorsement versus primary in terms of Republican messaging. But I do think that is a big thing, because we get 3 months before and suddenly have to moderate to a general voter base. And I think that's certainly a concern here.
Yes. And again, just an observer of this, I think that's kind of the tactical mistake. Again, this is just, please poke hole if you think my logic is wrong. I think the 2nd Congressional District is likely going to be the most targeted. Based on, I live there and you've worked there, it's a swing district. And so in just my head, I'm thinking of this as the best way for a Republican to win is to leave that convention in a position and ability to moderate and go to the center, because that's where I think the district is. I think it's a centrist district. And so my only point in just talking about the 2nd district race for kind of the first time on this podcast in this way is that I think the messaging, particularly from Rahm's side, has been pretty hard. And I think we're going to be back looking at this race and saying, how did we get here? And that's where I think we're at. But we'll see what happens on Saturday with the endorsement stuff. But your take.
The last thing I just want to say is curious. I know again, historically, endorsed candidates win primaries. It very rarely has that not been the case. Obviously, we've gone through ebbs and flows of what the party apparatus, even minus money, just volunteer, IDs, database, what they can do. I know there is a lot more cohesion with the House and Senate and Republican Party of working together on these types of things. What's your take on non-endorsed candidates and kind of that grassroots system they have to build up? Because I do think that is one thing that there is that built-in delegate base. Let's say Rahm comes out with winning the endorsement, you automatically get some of these BPOU, CD folks who are already involved doing their monthly, weekly meetings, whatever it might be, as door knockers, as phone callers, as texters, walking in parades, all of that. There is that built-in crew of folks. Non-endorsed folks, obviously, you assume have their base of supporters that they can get to do that too. But what's your take just on the kind of historical context of this rarely happening for non-endorsed folks candidates coming out successful in the primary?
Yes, correct. First of all, if whoever's endorsed on Saturday will get the party's support in some way. So if Rahm is endorsed or Teirab is endorsed, either of those candidates will become the Republican endorsed candidate for the 2nd Congressional District. With that comes some institutional support from the party as they navigate that party as they navigate through the primary. Teirab will have to do something that has not been done I think in recent time on this type of level, which is defeating a Republican endorsed candidate at the congressional district level. We were talking a little bit before we were recording here. There was one, I think, the fourth or fifth, I think it was in the fourth congressional district, the Republican endorsed candidate lost in the primary in 2020, did you say?
Yep, 2020, Shia Low.
But I think the argument that you may hear from people is there a if there's a primary challenge, does that hurt the Republicans in winning the general election? I don't think that there's any evidence to support that in the second congressional district or in other congressional districts that having a contested endorsement and then a contested primary has any impact on the general election. In fact, Klein was challenged by David Gerson in 2012. Emmer was challenged by Rana Sivaraja in 2014. Emmer was endorsed. Lewis was challenged in 16 by Darlene Miller. Lewis went on to win. Hagedorn was challenged by Carla Nelson in 2018. Hagedorn went on to win the general election. There was a multi-candidate primary in 2018. Emmer won. Fishbach was challenged in a multi-candidate primary, and she went on in winning the general election. Finstead in a special, there was a multi-candidate primary, and he won the special. And Finstead in the general, there was a primary versus Munson, and Finstead won the general. And so there is no question, I think the record is abundantly clear that primary contests do not equate to any type of general election loss, particularly in these somewhat centrist safe districts. This is obviously much more of a centrist district than it is a safe. It's a pure flip of the flop, as they say. So I think the question is, who will win the primary? But I don't think that there's much evidence to support that a primary contest hurts whoever wins the primary's chances of winning the general election. I don't think there's any evidence to support that. Do you see it that way or
No,
other way?
I agree. I guess it just comes down in a lot of the skepticism from Republican delegates and others is the mudslinging inter-party fighting between two Republican candidates leading up to August, which can be, depending on how dirty and how rough it can get. I could see that side of things. But you're right. You just listed off a plethora of places where Republicans were still successful despite having that contested primary. My last question before we get the chance to sit down with Joe here, again, zoomed out because I just love talking about endorsement versus primary. Do you think, whether it's in this situation or in any race in the near future, if a Republican candidate wins the primary against an endorsed candidate, that it would tend to move the party here, move Republicans away from demanding that endorsement ahead of time?
I think it's possible. I think you came up with a great compromise, which is June primary. I think that would make sense. I think Republicans in Minnesota have a very kind of confusing process, which is, and Democrats too. We have both primaries and caucuses. We have endorsing conventions and we have primaries. There is much more on the Democratic side, a history of there being challenges to the endorsement process and then candidates winning in the primary. Governor Walz, when he ran in 2018, was not endorsed by the DFL party. Senator, at the time it was Erin Murphy, but now she's a state senator. State Senator Erin Murphy, who's now the Senate Majority Leader, she was endorsed. She was defeated by Walz in the primary. And so there's much more of, I think, of a hands-off process approach that the Democrats take to allowing this stuff to happen. I think that this race in particular could be a real model to see what actually happens. The other race that I think is really insignificant to watch, since you brought up this point, and I'm glad you did, is Fishbach. She's being challenged right now. Congresswoman Fishbach in the 7th Congressional District. She's being challenged by a candidate. Fishbach has also said that she's going to seek, but she will not abide by the party's endorsement. So there's two congressional candidates right now. You have Joe Teirab and you have incumbent Congresswoman Michelle Fishbach willing to say, I'm going to seek the party's endorsement, but I'm not willing to abide by it. And I think that could be a real break in kind of the armor and kind of the stranglehold that the endorsement process have. Again, this is the last piece of evidence I would love for someone to show me. Give me evidence that says that a Republican getting endorsed, particularly statewide, is an actually net benefit to them winning the general election. My argument is in some of these congressional races, and in some of these statewide races, the fact that there's candidates out there that are able to fundraise and position themselves organizationally to win in the general is better. And I think what the endorsement process is doing right now is it's laying out an intramural contest for Republicans to win, and they're putting too much emphasis on it. And at the end of the day, focusing on it is a distraction from winning the general election. And I say that as someone who was a party officer, I was a BPOU chair. My position on the endorsement has absolutely evolved from where it is right now. And I would say only abide. I would say always plan for a primary, respectfully seek, but do not commit to abide by an endorsement, because this is a scenario where I think it may end up causing Republicans tripping up a bit on the process. But we'll wait and see.
Sounds good.
We're excited today to be joined by Joe Teirab, running for Congress in Minnesota's 2nd Congressional District. He made some news in the last 24 hours. Why don't you tell our listeners about that?
I did make some news. I'm really proud to be in this race because I love this country, and that's why I got in the race. I've had the opportunity to live the American dream. And I got in the race because the American dream right now is being attacked by Joe Biden and Angie Craig. My singular focus has been to beat Angie Craig. That's what I said in October. It's been an amazing opportunity to get a chance to meet with voters and people all across the district with that message. And at this point, I'm going to be taking the fight to the primary to make sure that we actually have the best candidate to go against Angie Craig. I've been able to put the team together and put the resources together to be in that fight. Because Angie Craig, sadly, she's funded by these Hollywood elites who are going to be able to give her tons of money. She has a ton of money in the bank, $2.8 million. We've been able to raise the resources to get that done and to actually take the fight to her. We have $666,000 in the bank right now. And my primary opponent has nothing, very little. He's got 59,000 cash on hand. And so for that reason, also for the reason of, look, I've been a prosecutor. My life has been about doing justice and putting bad guys behind bars. And of course, in our system, you have a right to a defense, no doubt. My opponent is a criminal defense attorney, similar to Mary Moriarty and Keith Ellison. And at this point, what we learned recently in the past month from this Fox News article was that he sanitized his website. He wasn't proud of his record, apparently, because he's defended some of the worst in our society, people like murderers, child rapists. The people in City 2 are going to care about that. And who's going to let them know about that? Angie Craig and the Democrats. We need to make sure that we are putting ourselves in the best position to beat Angie Craig. And I have to do what I think is right. That's what the people want, and that's what the people deserve. And I think the right thing to do right now is to not hand an election to Angie Craig. And that's why I'm continuing this fight to the primary.
You are an attorney. Talk a little bit about your background, how you became an attorney, and then also frame up a bit. You were a prosecutor versus defense attorney. I think that's some interesting contrast.
I did it when I was honored to serve as a federal prosecutor, putting bad guys behind bars across the state of Minnesota. That was my job, to work with law enforcement on investigating the worst of the worst in our society. And look, again, as a person who raised my right hand to support in the Constitution of the United States, I think that's what we should be going back to, is the Constitution. So of course, everyone has a right to a defense. But if we want to put ourselves in the best position to actually beat Angie Craig, we have to be real about what the liabilities are in terms of what our record is. And I've been proud about my record working with law enforcement to put those bad guys behind bars. And clearly it's the case where my opponent is not proud of his record because he sanitized his website talking about the people that he's defended. And so in those courtrooms, I went against the defense attorneys. I fought for justice. I was able to get justice in in all my federal trials. And I think the people of City 2 want someone who's fought for justice, who's worked with law enforcement, not against law enforcement. I've been blessed to live the American dream. I'm the son of an immigrant from Sudan, the grandson of a World War II POW. I grew up in a small town in Windham in Southwest Minnesota, 2 stoplights, 4,000 people. And I was blessed to be able to go to Cornell for undergrad. And I felt like it was on my heart to do justice, to help people. That's what I wanted to do. And so that's why I decided to go to law school. And so I went to some liberal institutions and fought for conservative values at both of those places, at Cornell and at Harvard Law School. And it was in Harvard Law School where I met a guy in my class who had, before his time in law school, was a Marine officer. And after being in country in Iraq for 2 weeks, stepped in IED, lost both of his legs. And he inspired me to become a United States Marine. And so I was honored to earn that title of United States Marine during law school. So during my time in the Marine Corps, I served for 5 years on active duty. I reached rank of captain, and I had the honor of deploying to Iraq to help defeat and destroy ISIS, to help fulfill Donald Trump's mission to do that. And that's what we did. I was there for 6 months working with soldiers, sailors, airmen, and fellow Marines in a coalition environment. And my job in the room as a lawyer was to give the up or down, thumbs up or down recommendations on our strikes against ISIS. And so that's what we did. We defeated ISIS. And I came home to Minnesota and served as a state prosecutor in St. Peter down in Nicollet County, where I worked to put domestic abusers behind bars. And then I was honored to serve as a federal prosecutor, was hired by a Trump appointee to do that, where I put illegal immigrants behind bars, meth traffickers behind bars, fentanyl traffickers behind bars, a cop killer behind bars. I got to work on some really big cases that I know your listeners have seen in the news, right? The Feeding Our Future trial case, which we're actually the first federal trial is happening this week. $250 million of money that was supposed to go feeding hungry kids and was stolen by these fraudsters and bought things like fancy cars, like property all across the second district of resort in Kenya. Got to work on and lead the investigation into the Bloods criminal street gang. We built up a RICO case, charged a bunch of Bloods, and we went at them. I was proud to lead that investigation with a team of federal agents, state and local law enforcement, and we took them out.
You have a very impressive record of service. And in particular, I want to highlight and just acknowledge, thank you for your service and serving in the military. It's not something I've ever done. And anytime we speak to people who have a military background, military service, we always want to acknowledge that. So thank you for your service.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
Absolutely concur. So you've had a really successful career. How did you make this decision then to want to step into a new role and run for public office? It's a big change.
It was a big change. It was a hard decision. It's one that I had to make with my friends and my family. I had to be prayerful about it because I absolutely loved my job as a federal prosecutor, because every day I got to ask myself the question, what's the right thing to do? How can I pursue justice? That's what I was able to do for 4 years, working on cases all across Minnesota, bringing justice to victims. But I really did feel like it was on my heart to fight for the American dream, because right now I think the American dream is being attacked by Angie Craig and Joe Biden when it comes to inflation, and Angie Craig voting for every single spending bill that Joe Biden has pushed for. She voted with Joe Biden 100% of the time. When it comes to the border, I had to put fentanyl traffickers behind bars and illegal immigrants behind bars. And right now you're seeing a border crisis because Angie Craig voted against the Secure Our Border Act back in May of last year. And the biggest thing for me is supporting law enforcement. Again, I worked with law enforcement hand in hand as a state prosecutor, as a federal prosecutor, and to see our politicians caring more about charging cops than criminals, that has a real impact on our communities. And people feel that and they know that. And right now we need someone in Congress who's going to fight to support law enforcement, fight to crack down on crime, fight to lower the cost of living, fight for better schools, fight to secure our border. And that's why I'm going to Congress, because I've been in that fight, both as a state prosecutor, federal prosecutor, and as a Marine.
In 2018, I was a campaign manager for Jason Lewis's reelection campaign, unfortunately unsuccessful, and Angie Craig did get elected. And so I just want to hear a little bit more about, you mentioned a few there, which are great. Some of the bills either that she voted on or some of the differences between what you want voters to know that are differences between you and Angie Craig and how you would represent the second better.
The differences are pretty vast. The big thing for me, one, is that she was a rubber stamp for Joe Biden's agenda. And so you just have to ask yourself the basic question, is your life better now than it was 4 years ago? And it's obviously not. She voted for everything that's led to inflation. And secondly, the Secure Our Border Act. We have a border crisis. She voted against H.R. 2, the Secure Our Border Act. And now we have human trafficking crisis. We have a fentanyl crisis, and we have illegal immigrants pouring over the border, 10 million under Joe Biden's administration. Unacceptable. And that falls right at the feet of Angie Craig. And then I think the big thing that I talked about again is cracking down on crime, my work with law enforcement. Angie Craig voted for the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act of 2020, and that would have absolutely kneecapped law enforcement. And I know now she's changed her tune about that act getting rid of qualified immunity, but she can't run away from that vote. And that vote would have kneecapped law enforcement in many different ways in terms of removing the resources that they need to keep our community safe.
I live in the 2nd Congressional District, and you've messaged a lot. And I want to ask you a question. You live in the district, you've traveled all across the district as you campaign. I live in Eagan, suburb. I think the impression amongst a lot of people in my neighborhood and people I speak with that Angie Craig has a moderate record. In your experience, in your travels, what are you hearing about that? And can you offer your perspective on where Angie Craig's record is on the political spectrum?
It's clear she is no moderate. She has done a good job at making it seem like she's a moderate, but her voting record paints a very different picture. Again, going back to her voting against border security, her voting against law enforcement, her voting with the Biden agenda 100% of the time, her voting even with Ilhan Omar 93% of the time. I don't know how you can call yourself a moderate when that's the case, and she can't run away from those facts.
This week there's an endorsing contest in the second congressional district. You've agreed now to run in the primary, but you're still seeking the endorsement. I want to dial down a little bit on some contrast that I've noticed in the last week. The race really seems to have heated up a bit in the second congressional district. You are a prosecutor. You have been a prosecutor in your career. Describe to our listeners the difference between what a defense attorney does and what a prosecutor does.
So as a prosecutor, my job is to work with law enforcement to investigate cases. So literally, for example, in the Bloods case, I was sitting in a room for about a year working with law enforcement, helping develop evidence, helping execute search warrants, helping to figure out what witnesses we should interview to build up a case to make sure that we're holding criminals accountable. And then my job as a prosecutor is literally to charge these criminals and then to litigate the case in court, potentially in front of a jury, and argue in front of that jury and present evidence to say, this is why you're guilty. The defense attorney, again, their job is to zealously defend the interests of their clients. And in this case, my opponent in this race was a criminal defense attorney. He apparently was not proud of his record as a criminal defense attorney because what we saw in this Fox News article, he hid from voters the type of defendants he defended. And those were the worst of the worst. Child rapists, murderers, people who literally spit in the face of law enforcement. I think the differences couldn't be any more clear. I worked with law enforcement to put bad guys behind bars. My opponent worked to set criminals free.
Thank you for explaining the role of a defense attorney versus a prosecutor. But both of them, you have a right to. And so strike that balance a bit for ensuring that everyone has a adequate and proper defense, but also ensuring that justice is administered.
My job as a prosecutor, the first thing I did as a federal prosecutor was raise my right hand to support and protect the Constitution of the United States. And that's precious to me. And on the defense side, you have a constitutional right to a defense. My job as a prosecutor was to work with law enforcement to develop evidence, to find evidence, to build up cases against criminals, to make sure that we're holding them accountable. So that's what I did for about a year in a room with state, local, and federal law enforcement to build up the case against the Bloods criminal street gang. And then I charged those criminals and they had their day in court. And 95% of the time in our system, people plead guilty. Sometimes they want to go to trial. And my job was to make the case in front of the jury that they are guilty. And that's what happened in all 6 of my federal trials. My opponent apparently was not proud about his record. I'm proud of my record. I talk about it all the time, about the cases that I've worked on. He, according to this Fox News article, scrubbed his website before he got into the race to hide the fact that he was defending some of the worst people, like child molesters, people like murderers, people who spit in the face of law enforcement. So while you have a fundamental right to a defense, I think we need to be clear about what types of attacks that the left are going to hurl at who the person going against Andrew Craig is going to be. I'm proud of my record. My opponent is not.
And I think that's a very interesting contrast, Becky. It's obviously he's making the point that everyone is entitled to justice, criminals and the public in this instance. But I think it exposes a real challenge when you're a criminal defense attorney running for office. Again, everyone has a right to an attorney and they have in that process. And I think we're all an advocate for that, but there is some challenge. There are some jobs out there that if you take them as your profession, it does become a little difficult to run for political office because, as you're pointing out, the public has an opportunity to litigate.
And I think it's no surprise that many or most people who run for office as criminal defense attorneys or public defenders end up running as Democrats.
That's a great point.
Mary Moriarty, former failed public defender in Minnesota. Keith Ellison, former defense attorney for Bloods gang members in the 90s. So I don't think it's any surprise that many people are wondering or questioning, why is my opponent running as a Republican, as a former criminal defense attorney? It's an interesting choice.
I appreciate you explaining that because I had not made that connection. And then when he was saying it, I was like, darn, why didn't I think of that? I would have sounded smart. But he sounded smart explaining because I had not thought about that before. Then on the defense side, if you think you look at Mary Moriarty, you look at Keith Ellison, both of them were very active in criminal defense work. And so, yeah, that seems to be more of a natural constituency on that type of side. And so it's not surprising to me the positioning of the race right now then. That's very interesting.
I don't know the last time I've seen it where it's such a stark contrast between the two candidates, right? A prosecution versus defense is an interesting duo here. We are moving through the endorsement process, conventions this upcoming weekend. How has that process been? I know CD2 has changed a little bit since I worked there. We've talked a lot. I came up in the activist delegate base, but we've talked a lot about primaries and the importance of primaries as well. But CD2 is a big district. Talk to us a little bit about the travels and who you've met and the conversations you've had along the way.
Honestly, it's been a blast, and it's been a ton of fun meeting with voters all across the district. Honestly, going around LeSueur County, I felt like many of these small towns were like my hometown of Windham. Got to meet with farmers, with teachers, with cops. It's been a blast to listen to them, to grab coffees, to grab beers, to go into their living rooms and to hear the challenges that they're facing. And it's just been crushing and sad to hear people like, for example, a guy him and his wife bought a property in Southern Dakota County, and they had to go through no less than 11 different approvals and licenses and permits just to build a little bridge across a stream of 3 feet of water. Like, talk about overregulation. Or a woman who was hounded by the Walz administration for a small overpayment through the federal child nutrition program, which is the same program that was totally okay with giving millions and millions of dollars wrongfully and illegally to all these fraudsters. And so that was just crushing to hear her tell me that. And honestly, when she told me that in this small little bar, Seward County, my mouth dropped, because I was on the side of rooting out this waste, fraud, and abuse at the same time that Keith Ellison and Tim Walz didn't care too much to actually care about where our hard-earned taxpayer money is going.
Talk about the importance of where the race is at right now and the importance of coming out of that primary with a strong candidate. Why is your campaign in a better position than your opponent right now on the Republican side to face off against Angie Craig? I saw the fundraising numbers and I was surprised. Having not followed the fundraising totals, I was really shocked by the disparity between how a little your opponent had raised on the Republican side and how much you had raised, but in particular, where Angie Craig is. And so if you're a Republican in the second district, if you're an independent in the second district and you're looking for another candidate, it's good that there's an opportunity for Republicans to have a strong funded campaign operation in the second. Talk about that importance from your perspective.
Michael, I hate the fact that money is a part of politics. I wish it wasn't the case. Honestly, the only type of fundraising that I've ever done in my life was for a church mission trip back in college. But the reality is that you have to get your message out there, and that's going to cost money. And you have to raise the resources to actually take the fight to the left and to Angie Craig, because they're going to be well funded. They're going to get their message out there. Right now, Angie Craig has $2.8 million in the bank. So we can't just put our head in the sand on that. And we're never going to get that amount of money, but we have to have enough money. And right now, I have the money that it's going to take to go against Angie Craig. You can't come to a firefight with a squirt gun. And right now, unfortunately, my opponent has only $59,000 in the bank. He actually went backwards quarter to quarter. He lost money. I've been able to raise the money. I'm proud that we have $660,000 right now, cash on hand. I'm proud of the fact that we've over 90% of our donations are small dollar donations, I think under $40. I'm proud of the fact that people are getting behind our campaign. Conservatives everywhere are getting behind the campaign to actually take the fight to Angie Craig. We're going to be able to do it. I think this is the very reason, Michael, why the Cook Political Report about a month ago shifted the race from likely Democrat to lean Democrat. And if you look at the article, the Cook Political Report talked about how it was because of our campaign and our ability to take our message out there and our ability to raise the resources to get it done.
I want to wrap up our chat today by going through, again, convention is this upcoming weekend. You have decided you're going to the convention. You are still seeking the endorsement, but you have ultimately made the decision to move on to the primary. Just walk us through one more time, weighing that decision, why you believe that's the best path forward to beat Angie Craig in November.
Look, all I can do is do the right thing. And I think right now, handing Angie Craig an easy victory is not the right thing. And so for me, it's been an honor and a blast to meet with grassroots activists all across the district. I've learned so much and I've made lifelong friendships. It's been an amazing opportunity to do that. But at the same time, you have to walk and chew gum. And I've been fighting hard for the endorsement, but I've also been building the campaign to go against Angie Craig and to actually beat her. And so on day one, I'll be ready to do that because I've been able to raise the resources to get that done. To get your message out there, you have to have the resources. And we've been doing that. We have over $660,000 cash on hand right now. It's 10 times what my opponent has. I'm going to be able to go against Angie Craig. I know she's scared of our campaign. I know the left is scared of our campaign. I've taken flack from a Democrat, George Soros funded super PAC. If you're taking flack, that means you're over the target. We're over the target. They're scared of us. And I'm going to be honored to be in the fight to go against Angie Craig and beat her.
We want to thank you for coming in today, and we hope that we can continue the dialogue. Where can people follow your campaign for more information?
Yeah, you can definitely go to joeformn2.com. So it's joeformn2.com. Also check me out on Twitter and Facebook and all the socials.
Great. Well, thank you so much for spending some time with us today. We look forward to watching the campaign. And as always, we'd love to have you back at some point down the road to talk more about the race. But good luck. Safe travels across the 2nd District.
Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you so much, Becky.
Thank you.
Yeah, bye-bye. Becky, we just interviewed Joe Teirab. Your take?
He certainly is an impressive individual, has his career as a prosecutor in the Marines, going through law school, very impressive. Certainly somebody who really is in it for the right reasons, looking to fight for justice and our liberties and take on Angie Craig and the liberals. My initial take is CD2 is a beast, man. I think that it's really going to be, while it is a toss-up, or not a toss-up, it's a lean Dem, but I think it's very close there, right? It's right on the fringes. And having worked there before, it's certainly there's some really blue parts and some really red parts and a lot in the middle. It's going to be a lot to take her down. In general, she's got a war chest. She's got the friends. She's got all of these Hollywood elites and the liberals all up the wazoo, like Andrew Craig, want to see her, bring her around. And the biggest thing I think that whether it's Joe or Taylor, messaging against Angie is really going to have him trying to poke holes because her, like Joe mentioned, she is able to present herself as this nice moderate who has worked really hard and kept her head down. And so I think that there are a decent amount of voters in the 2nd who buy into that. And so it's really going to take poking holes in that. But I think Joe, he really seems like he's ready to fight and go to the primary and be successful. Time will tell. We'll certainly have another conversation later down the line. But I understand the not going for the endorsement, not abiding, and going to a primary makes sense in my head. Yeah.
I guess I'm reading between the lines a bit. Your take is, I guess I'm sensing this is a big step. This is the 2nd Congressional District. You've worked, I live there, but you've worked it from an operations standpoint. This is a major league race.
Big time.
And so in order to run in a major league race, you have to be a major league candidate. Mm-hmm. And so I think there's going to be a learning process for whoever ends up being the main candidate against Angie Craig. Is that what you're kind of saying?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, to be perfectly frank, from my viewing of it, it appears that Taylor Rahm is going to come out with the endorsement. It appears that Joe has the fundraising lead. There's certainly different things that come with both of those things being in your back pockets. So I think we'll see how they fight it out. We'll see if they fight a lot out against each other, if they're still fighting Angie Craig in the mix of that, because that certainly, as a campaign, you have to look at that whole picture. You're obviously trying to get past the August primary, but you also need to be having those arrows going towards your incumbent opponent, and that's Angie Craig. And I like to wear my partisan hat as much as the next person, but she's been a pretty hard worker and seems to have, while taken, some votes that we can certainly, Joe mentioned, and that we can poke holes in. From my understanding and conversations with people in the 2nd District, there's not a huge uproar against Angie Craig.
Yes, she has done a very good job of positioning herself in this. And Joe talked about it a bit in terms of poking some holes in that. That's going to be a messaging struggle to get that message out so people understand that. I do want to ask you about one thing, which I thought was interesting. Both Rahm and Teirab are lawyers.
Crazy.
They're both lawyers, but on different sides of the spectrum. And I want to share a story which I think I've shared, I know I've spoken with folks in both campaigns, and I've shared this story before, which is there was a state senator that I knew. He's since passed away. Tom Neville was a state senator. And I first met him when I worked at the Senate in 99 and 2000. And I was helping on some of the incumbent races. And I remember him talking to me about the fact that his opponent at the time, for when he was running for re-election in 2000, that he was being criticized about some of his past work or some of the work he was doing as a lawyer. Senator Neville at the time was a defense attorney and had done some work. And so he was frustrated that it wasn't more recognized by people in the public that the person accused of a crime has just as much, it also needs to be protected in the process. And I remember having this kind of conversation when we talked about it. And I said, you have every right to choose your profession that you choose to do. It's a citizen legislature. There are jobs that exist out there that do not necessarily equate sometimes to serving in public office. And so I understand your zealous advocacy on behalf of your client, but that doesn't mean that the public loses the right to be critical about the type of cases and stuff that you worked on. And it was a struggle in that kind of conversation we had for him to understand that, yes, he had every right to do what he was going to do. He had every right to zealously advocate for his clients. But when you decide to zealously advocate on behalf of some clients who are not some of the best in society in terms of the crimes that they've committed, that is absolutely fair game in an election cycle. And one thing that I've picked up on a bit is some questions about, I think both candidates are going to have some discussions about their legal records. But it's clear that one campaign is somewhat sensitive, and that's Rahm's campaign, with some of his past work that he's done as a lawyer. And I would just say, not all jobs, not private work that you do in your private life does not necessarily equate, and not everyone will consider the work that you do in your private life to be a net asset when you're running in a general election. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, everything that you do and who you are can be picked apart, right? How you spend your free time, who you spend your free time with. There's guilt by association. There's, if you have some, for example, marijuana legal in the state of Minnesota. If a candidate ran under the Republican banner who openly was promoting that they like to do that in their free time, 100% okay. Not necessarily probably going to align with what folks are talking about. Now, that's not, it's apples and oranges here. But I'm saying when you are a candidate, unfortunately or fortunately, those things can be discussed and picked on. And it appears that Joe and the Teirab campaign is using that. And that's a fair thing for them to assess and criticize.
I wish in this particular kind of small way that Republicans would do a better job of getting ahead of this stuff. It's something that I've said privately to folks, that this type of material, and we've seen what's happens with the Democrats and how they can weaponize and this type of political stuff. And to think it's off limits, I think is a misreading of the political environment that we're in. And I think both candidates have records in the court, which is interesting to see. One on the prosecutor side, one on the defense side. But both of those records are open to scrutiny and analysis by the voters. That's what happens when you run for office. Your records get litigated. So we'll see what happens, but it was interesting to talk to him. Other takes that you have?
Yeah, he's very likable. I do think he sounds a little green on some of the messaging. I think he needs to firm up, just being a little bit more concise and thoughtful and tying some of the things together from my messaging background. But he seems like a good guy. He seems like he's obviously got some good money in the bank, has been working on that. I hope that anytime anybody is going to not abide, again, we talked about this a little on the front end. It sounds like he's got good supporters around him, but you certainly need to build up that system of folks who are going to be out there working for you. And we have this convention in just a few days. As Joe mentioned, he's going to be there. He is seeking the endorsement, not abiding if he does not win. It will be interesting to see what those numbers come out as and how many ballots it may go, because I've been through some brutal ones, 6 rounds, 11 rounds into 2 a.m., coming back the next day. Usually CD conventions have a hard end cap of they either need to get an endorsement or not. And it sounds like because you've already pledged to go to a primary, that if it was going too long, you would just pack up and go towards the primary, right? So
yeah, my take is one ballot and then it's off to the primary. And we'll see where it goes. But we'll be covering it. We'll be breaking it down as we continue.
Let's have a bet here, though, because I feel you can't just go one ballot, right? You got to see if you can get some movement on the second.
No, I think it's one ballot.
You think?
I think it's a one ballot. I've been saying that for quite some time, that I think it's a one ballot victory, which is interesting because some might listen to my analysis here and say that I've.
You think it will be done? Like, Rahm will be endorsed ballot
I
one.
absolutely believe that Rahm will win on the first ballot.
Straw polls and what I've been seeing coming out of conventions do appear. I thought you were saying that it was not going to be done on one, but that Joe would just step away.
I think it's going to be one ballot.
Decisive. Nice.
I think Rahm will win on the first ballot. The question is in the percentage, particularly because I think when you announce the week of, you're gonna seek but not abide by the endorsement and run in the primary. That can be there. There are a number of endorsement zealots. And I came into the party, my first campaign that I worked on was Botchwish's race in 96. I started in 95. He did not abide by the endorsement. He chose to seek, but not abide by the endorsement. And so I've had it. My first campaign was that kind of process. And I was at the last state convention where they did not reach an endorsement. There was some bureaucratic issues that happened at the convention. The party changed the rules to allow that. But at the 1996 endorsing convention, there was no candidate endorsed for the United States Senate. I later had jobs at the party and worked at the party where my job was to enforce the endorsement process, particularly when I was a party officer, both at the local and state level. But my positioning on the endorsement process has evolved. And this is the exact type of situation. I understand that there are passionate people these days that are in 2024 that desperately want people to abide by the endorsement. But my messaging on that hasn't changed, which is show me how the endorsement process is helping, in particular in these statewide or in these swing districts, these highly targeted districts, how that endorsement process is working. And in this particular instance, I don't think it is.
Just my last comment on this is I've also helped with Scott Honor, who ran for governor in 2014. He went down to the convention in Rochester, did a press conference saying, I'm not going for the endorsement. I'm going straight to a primary, was unsuccessful in the primary. Mike McFadden was a little bit of a trailblazer in the I'm going to be seeking but not abiding by the endorsement. And I was working on his endorsement team as well, and then on staff as his press secretary. And he went in and he worked tirelessly for 3 days. That was one that we closed out at 2 a.m., I think, and came back the next morning was chaos. He did, even though he said that he was not going to abide, did come out on top and receive that endorsement in 2014 for Senate against Franken. Obviously not successful in that general. But one nugget I want to say about that is the one thing I love about politics are the relationships and friendships. And that McFadden 2014, two of the guys on that endorsement team are both on opposite sides of this battle in CD2. So it's always funny to see as things break down and see as they come back around. But it will be, this weekend is also CD7. So we'll have lots of big CD conventions to watch. We'll be coming back, I think, around and talking more about CD7 and Otter Tail and some of the chaos, again, the disruptors that can be within the delegates and the party apparatus. Good folks, bad folks. They will be interesting to watch.
Thanks for doing this.
Have a good one.
Bye. We want to thank you for listening to this bonus episode of The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky. Before we go, show some love for your favorite podcast by leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts or on the platform where you listen. You can also leave a review on our website at bbreakpod.com. The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky will return this week with a new episode. Thank you again for joining us.